Customer Insights, Building Empathy, prepared for and presented at the 2016 Square One Entrepreneurship Training Program. Square One is a program of the Center for Emerging Technologies. CET is an affiliate of the Cortex Innovation Community. Square One is funded in part by the Missouri Technology Corporation.
When we think about customer insight, is exactly what it is. We are talking to what some people like to call consumers, even though I feel like that is it's like, hey, you're a user. But you know, when you think about customer insight, you're trying to understand the trends, you're trying to understand human behavior and why they will buy or use the product or service or whatever your entrepreneurial venture is, why they want it in the first place. But it always goes back to the root of actually connecting with them. And I think this gentleman right here, when he was talking about using their language and having a conversation, I know it seems overly complex, but talking to people is one of the most important things we possibly can do. And yet, in many of our organizations, especially small ones, it's hard to do it because we don't have the resources, we don't have the bandwidth. Market researchers literally make a lot of money because it is such a huge value. And while corporations can spend a lot of money on that, as startups, we really don't have that benefit of a doubt unless we get an investor or something of that nature. But even if you can't get a massive audience of 3,000 or 50,000 respondents to a survey or interview or focus groups, you can still find ways to connect with their audience, bring in their input, and help you build out a better product or service. So when many people think about research, it usually falls in two brackets. You have quantitative and you have qualitative, and you have some people that respond to one more than the other. Quantitative is what a lot of entities prefer to kind of rely on, just because you can send out a digital survey, especially in today's email or digital age, and easily get data. It's probably the most simple thing you can do. Yes, you should spend an extensive amount of time developing your questions and your questionnaire and looking at what's my benchmarks and what am I actually trying to measure, what do I want? But with surveys, it's as simple as hitting the easy button. Whereas with qualitative, it requires what we like to call human capital or sitting down with people. And majority of the time, it also requires you having someone that's unbiased and neutral, which is hard to do when you're an entrepreneur. You know your product best, and I've been in settings that have been good and it's been done bad, where I've seen people where someone will have a round table and someone will give a response saying, I don't agree with this, or I disagreed when you took this approach, and the facilitator, also being an employee of the company, would argue with them in the middle of that session. That is not what you want to do. I think Crystal said it best, where yes, you want the insight, but you also have to recognize when the insight can hinder you or you have to kind of overlook it. And the fact that she brought up Apple was a great example. Or if we think about Ford, he said, if I would have interviewed my customer, they said I wanted a faster horse, not a car. And so you have to be able to balance that act of understanding the importance of research, but then also knowing that, okay, while they may have this perspective, this is why my product is innovative and why we are kind of shattering that mold. But make sure it's a combination of both. Whereas with qualitative, when we think about it, it mainly comes along two lines of interviewing and focus groups. There are other ways to get qualitative research, which I'm going to list out. But think about what can I do now as an organization, and it could be also pulling secondary research such as Nielsen or things of that nature that already has done data for you. So I would even look into that type of avenue. But then also, what can I do in 3 months? What can I do in 6 months? And how can I integrate research into our daily work? Because when Crystal said, I see products and I see brands going hand in hand, I see your product and service going hand in hand with research. With our company, we literally get feedback on every single thing that we do. Even today, I see that you have the surveys out here today. They're getting feedback on every single session that they hold because they see the importance of modifying it based on the individuals that they're serving, and you need to find a way to integrate that into the work that you're doing. But one thing about trends, which I can't say I'm a fan of, I'm neutral when it comes to them, but one thing about trends is that it leads to competence in that space, and unfortunately competence can sometimes equal assumptions or stereotypes. And I know it's not intended, majority of the time it's not, but we have a tendency to, and I will show you an example of a user persona later, but we have a tendency to say, okay, my audience is in this bubble, not really recognizing that you have outliers and you have people that's not gonna fit that bubble, but they still may have an interest in the space in which you're working. I like to always tell people, when people assume who I am or what type of music I like, I'm like, look, I don't listen to NPR, to be honest, because it just is not for me. I'm a video girl all day, and I wake up listening to techno every single day. It's like if the party's not rolling, it's not happening. But especially if you were to say what they typically do, African American community, they tend to R&B or rap. It's like that stereotype that's out there. Don't get me wrong, I will listen to a rap song, not R&B. I can't stand it. But we don't always fit into these modes, so you have to be very conscious of that and say, while yes, we have these trends, let's also look at those outliers that don't fit in that mode and how do we serve them as well. So in moving beyond competence, what we need to strive for is humility. And usually I have this saying cultural humility, but there's other forms. I didn't want it just to be focused on culture, but there's all these different identities out there. And we have to recognize that there are stereotypes and assumptions assigned to them, but our job is to move beyond that. And to think about it in the lens of humbleness, and I love this when it says, to denote a willingness to accurately assess oneself and one's limitations, the ability to acknowledge gaps in one's knowledge, and an openness to new ideas, contradictory information, and advice. So when we do research, I have to ask you, who usually does the research? And you can thought this is not rocket science, it's pretty easy. Who does research? PhDs. Do you have a PhD in your company? Will you be able to do research in your company without a PhD? Yes. All right, I'm gonna challenge you to think beyond that. I'm gonna challenge you today. So, beyond PhDs, who else does research? Interns? Yep. Right. People we can make do stuff for cheap or free. Amen to that. So I'm gonna give you this bucket that we tend to avoid. The individuals that do research are people. I know it's like, what? No, I thought you wanted specific. At the end of the day, whether it's a PhD, an intern, a president or CEO, a market researcher, they are people. And they have their bias. Whether in whatever form or fashion, there's a bias there. And that's why many times when we say when you conduct research, you have to have many different parties at the table that's going to give you a diversity of perspective, a diversity of thought. And so when you do your research, while if you have an intern do it, also have a director look into it or have a role within it. And also, I would argue, have a community member that's actually affected by whatever topic it is as part of the equation. At Creative Reaction Lab, we literally intentionally try to have 4 stakeholders at the table. The civic and social sector, because they're experts on the theory, in our case, especially since we're socially minded, the theory of the issue, as well as being the frontline responders, and they know about policy. We want the business sector because they're experts of scale and sustainability. So whatever solutions we come up with, we have to think about how is it going to remain viable and sustainable in the market. We want the creative sector, which majority of the time they are forgotten about, our poor designers and artists and that space there, but their job literally is to create nothing from something every single day. They navigate complexity all the time. And so we want them at the table. And then we want community members, or as we like to call them, the living experts, because they know the day-to-day impact of whatever we're trying to understand. So figure out who's my stakeholders, who do I need at the table for us to always have a great assessment on whatever we're trying to do, essentially. So today I'm going to use the design thinking process just because it's, one, become a very nice buzzword, and then two, its root is around building empathy, and I like to say it's around research and taking ideas and moving it into action. And so it's not just around getting the knowledge or getting that information, but then testing, reassessing, and going through this process over and over again. Like I said, everything that we do, we literally assess every single thing. And it's not always just a survey at the end. It's dialogue, it's feedback, it's whatever thing, anything we possibly can so that we can improve. An example of this, and this was not in my company, I used to be head of communications at Diversity Awareness Partnership here in St. Louis. And when I was there, one, I learned a lot because designers like very small type. And we're like, let's put some 6-point font on something. And it's like, that is sexy, all right? Don't touch it, all right? But is that really user-friendly? No. I still argue with my design friends about that. Even my design intern, I'm like, it's not happening. Nope, I don't want that small font. But an example of this beyond the font was I did a video for our group, for our summit. And it was a video that had music and images, all these different things. And then everyone came up and was like, that was fantastic, thank you. And you're like, yeah, I'm awesome, okay. But then someone came up to me afterwards and she said, I'm assuming the video was great, but I am visually impaired. So all I did was I heard the video and there was no words. There was nothing for me to even get a context of what the video is. And that made me open my eyes. And now every time I do a video, yes, I make sure there's text at the bottom, but then I also say, what language are we verbally saying for people that are visually impaired? That was an example. That was just one person that changed the way that I view my work. So sometimes it takes as simply as one person to shatter that ego and push you to that next step. But back to design thinking, one thing I want to also point out quickly is today we're not going to talk about ideating because I'm pretty sure you know how to brainstorm. So I'm not going to do that with the Post-it notes. But also, this is not a linear process. Many people see this and they say, okay, I need to go through this step and this step and this step. That is not how design thinking works. It's literally constantly iterating. I'm kidding you not, sometimes going back to the beginning because you realize that you were down the wrong path. I had a team in one of our labs tend to be 24-hour long. They, at 9 a.m., realized that they were on the completely wrong path and they had to start over. After being there for so many hours, and don't believe me, it was heartbreaking for that team. And I felt bad, I had to leave them in the room for a minute. I was like, have your moment of crying, okay? But that is what we have to do because if we don't truly understand the problem, you're more likely not creating the correct solution. And so you have to, whether it hurts or not, it may make you spend more time because it's like we're okay with spending more money, but not spending more time. You sometimes have to spend more time just to make sure you are getting to the root of the problem that you're trying to solve. So the question we're always asking is, what do I want to learn? Very simple, base, it's what you need to know. What do I want to learn? Have it guide you. But one thing, it's interesting, I heard this at Murmuration and I almost jumped on, was like, that is incorrect. But they were like, we need to design for our communities. And I was like, no, you need to design with your community. Because when you have that mindset that I'm designing for something, you and yourself then take a step back. It's us and them, okay? We're not a part of that equation. But if you're not directly immersed within whatever you're working within, then have people on your team that are. Because you need to design with people that are impacted by whatever you're doing. If not, you're going to have a skewed perspective on your output. So when building empathy, don't mind this. It's pretty much just like, what would the individual use or understand? What do they want to know? How would they do something? And you're trying to determine a specific need for that individual. It's easy to go any and everywhere, and believe me, research is messy. It's very messy. Even at Creative Reaction Lab, we've been around 2 years, and I'm still sitting here thinking, like, am I looking at the right social problem? Like, what, hey, give me feedback. I think I'm losing my mind. All right, like, that is normal. It is messy. And on one of those handouts, you see like this squiggle in the research component. That is the truth of the pudding. It is not cute. It is not honestly fun unless you're a researcher by trade. And even then, they will argue that they are stressed out sometime at work. But you have to move beyond that research and really try to distill down and aggregate your data and synthesize what you're looking for. And that's when you get to the design. You look like you have a question. Go for it. Go ahead. You can raise the hand.
I have a really serious, important question, actually. It can wait till later if you want, but if it's too long, you can tell me afterwards.
Okay.
So what I want to know is usually, and this is what I heard for research, when you're looking at your market, you start on that, like, nationally, depending on your product, but generally you start nationally, like the big, and then you bring it down. But now with what you're saying, or with what you're presenting, it almost sounds like you're saying start where you are and then build out. Like,
it is a combination. Let me be very clear, because believe me, I'm in St. Louis, and like Chrissy said, I travel around different nations, but I'm researching what's happening in our nation, but then I'm also researching what's happening in St. Louis. And so it's literally, I'm doing both at the same time. But one of the things I will say is that it's easier to start big and go down than to start small and try to go up. But you have to look at what's my bandwidth and my capacity and what's my priority. Because if you don't have that planned out or understood, then you are going to be all over the place. I know for a fact that we are looking at city resilience and the impact of social justice issues or civic engagement around that space. And similar, when you were talking earlier, we are touching on many different areas. Like some people, they're looking directly at racial inequality. We're looking at race, gender, sexual orientation, all these things and how that impacts civic engagement, civic pride, and ultimately city resilience. That is literally 20 different topics that I can be researching. And it is a lot. But I have to figure out what do I actually need to, one, build my brand, build my messaging, and come up with the best programming or products or services to reach what I'm trying to reach. But I'm still researching 2 years in. And Coca-Cola or Pepsi, they're still researching, and they've been around for decades. That's just the nature of the game. But I would do a combination of both.
So actually, it sounds like you're coming up with sort of a similar problem that mine does, in that you can boil the ocean, like you can solve and research that problem for many different target segments. So my question is, how do you define your partner, your specific need that you're trying to solve for? It's kind of like it's almost maybe the same question, but like in a broad enough way that you feel like you have a market, and yet a narrow enough way that you can be differentiated. Like, do you define maybe traditional personas, and you sort of go after those personas? Or
right.
What do you think?
So one of the things, so when Creative Reaction Lab started, we only focused on designers. And that was a flaw. That was a mistake. My research took me down the wrong path. So then I had to go back to the drawing board and actually try to assess what are we actually trying to solve. That was like the biggest question that I had fast forward past. So I had to really look at what is the bigger issue that we're trying to solve, and then how are we filling this gap within our neighborhood. And sometimes some people tell you to, like in our instance, maybe you should start hyper-local. Because I could sit there and say, in Ferguson, because I am a former Ferguson resident, in Ferguson, these are the issues, and therefore this is what I'm trying to address. But then the woman I was talking with yesterday at Memoration, she's in Boston, and they have similar issues than we have in St. Louis. I can use, and so we were talking about how can I use her research to make a case for what we're doing here, and then a national case and an international case, because she's part of that conglomerate. And so it really is looking at, what problem are you trying to solve, how are you going to approach it? But it's kind of hard to get there. Go ahead.
So you targeted a specific problem, credentialized, and then abstracted.
And I did a lot of interviewing. And when I first, and this is one thing about being an entrepreneur, you have some people that will tell you that's the greatest idea in the world and will lead you down the wrong path. When I was focused on designers, all the designers, because that's who I was talking to, that is fantastic. We need that. Yes. Okay. And then I was sitting there and I was thinking, and I started interviewing people and talking to my colleagues outside of design. And that's when they provided me the perspective that I didn't think was relevant. And it made me actually scale up. And that's why I say it's easier to go down than to go. Because believe me, it's harder to scale up than to scale down. But it made me scale up on what our reach and what we're trying to do. But it required me talking to people with a different perspective and a different outlook than myself. So when Crystal said a little earlier, and don't tell her I said this because I never disagree with her in front of her face, but she pretty much alluded to the fact of talking to people that knows about your product. When she was talking about value proposition, she said, talk to them that know a little bit about your product. No, you need to talk to people that have no idea what you're doing, because they will provide you insight than that person that knows about your product or knows about your industry. You need to talk to people that have no idea what you're doing, because like she said, with that 6-year-old has no idea what you're doing. And it's the same when it comes to research. You have to talk to people outside of that realm. And I know it sounds like a lot of work, but they will make you think about your product and your services differently than someone that's within that community.
That's exactly how been my experience for the years I've been here. I'll start talking about something and I'm like, well, when I'm talking to manufacturers or someone who's done this, or I'm talking on the phone with a seller, like developers, they know exactly what I'm talking about. But being here has made me really think about this isn't gonna work. It's just not gonna work. Or wow, this is what I need to focus on. And I mean, like the fact that I've gone to the drawing board in these past few weeks more than I ever have, and it's really made me. At least I know like I can't focus on that, or I need to do this, because it made me go back and look at some research that I was interpreting through my own bias.
You need to have people that will argue with you. I am known in my group of friends as the dissenter. I will be that person that will be like, you know what? Wait a minute. Like, I don't know. Everyone else is shaking their head. Yes, that makes no sense to me. Okay, but you need people that will do that for you, because they will challenge you to think beyond what you're thinking. If you have people that just agree with what you're doing, you're not gonna get better, and you're probably not solving the true problem. Just scratch the head. I'm there with you. So why do we need to build empathy? One, because we want to have solutions that are user-centered, or as I like to say, people-centered. When we think about, and she talked about emotions and someone asked about emotions, everything is driven on feelings these days, whether we want to recognize it or not. Majority of the times when we buy products or a service, it's whether we connect with someone, and I'm not gonna curse because I know Christy would yell at me, even though I tend to drop some bombs, but I will naturally, we're good?
I'm not gonna edit you.
You're not gonna edit me?
Later when we do the tape.
Right. But no, I'm a person that I can truly love the product, but if the customer service representative is an asshole, I won't buy it. I am that person. I've literally watched football games, which I love, by the way, and, sad we lost an NFL team, whether we agree with how well they were or not. But, I will watch football teams and literally, I know this is horrible, but I will switch teams if someone seems like an asshole like I've done it during the Super Bowl. I'm like, you know what? I don't even like you anymore. And I would literally switch over, because we are emotionally driven, whether we want to recognize it or not. Even the ones that have that stoic demeanor and we feel like they don't have emotions, they have emotions too. It's just hidden. And we have to understand how we can tap into their emotions or pull that out and see how our brand or our product or our service is fitting within that realm. And so we need to be people-centered in any solution in which we come out, because they're the ones that's going to use it, or they are the ones that's going to rebel against it, point blank at the end of the day. Also, you want to have a better understanding of the problem. Like I said, if you don't know the problem, you're not probably coming up with the best solution. And they have access to this, right?
Yes.
Okay. And one of the things I always talk about is this avoidance of fishbowl perspective, which is so interesting because working in diversity and inclusion, one of the favorite activities they love to do is the fishbowl activity, where you have a group of people in the middle, you have people on the outside, and then the people in the middle usually respond to some prompt, how it made them feel, things of that nature. And then the people on the outside gives insight on, what they saw. Look, okay, avoid fishbowl perspectives. Avoid being on the outside looking in. You need to be immersed within that community, whatever that community is, at the end of the day. So you, whether it's you, your partner, your interns, whatever it may be, but just like for companies that are working in Africa, you can't be in the United States doing work when you're in Africa. Like if your company's in Africa, be in Africa. Like that's what you need to do. When you're not, then we have to ask the true intentions of your program, your product, your service. So immerse yourself within whatever you're doing. In building empathy, there's different ways to do it: discussions, observations, interactions, looking at what people do. But you have to look at essentially the holistic person and the holistic experience and not just one specific thing. Because in looking at how people interact in their normal settings or interacting with people in their normal settings, there's insight that you will gain that you wouldn't have otherwise through a survey. You have to understand their choices, their experiences, and that will help you better identify their needs. So besides surveys, here are some of the different types of ethnographic research, which I'm more of a fan of. You interview. You also have discussions that can be actually a town hall. I don't have that listed, but that could be a form of researching. You have observations, you have walk a mile immersions, which is interesting because I personally believe you can never walk a mile in someone's shoes, but this is what they called it in the research world, so that's why it's up here, okay? You have journaling, you have critique, you have usability skills. In UX world, they have A/B testing. You have all these different forms of research in which you can pull insight. Yes? So the critique research process is when you would sit there and you would use your product in front of someone, and then you have someone critique you on how you're using it, or where they see the gaps or challenges, and then vice versa. If they're the ones using it, and then not you but someone else will say, well, it would have been better if it was this or that. So a lot of times you'll see it being used with honestly, cardboard prototypes if you don't have a real one, where you have, or if you have an app on a phone, where you have people that click it and they slide do and they do all this, but then they give feedback while they're doing it. They're critiquing your product while you're right there. But I can send you more information on that as well.
I get it all the time with my bag. There's always women who like little or big or one pocket.
Mm-hmm.
So I try to listen and try to grasp into all of it, right? I mean, I
Yeah.
have to give the women who like the little bags,
Mm-hmm.
bags, and also the women who like the ones with lots of pockets.
FYI, I'm a big bag girl, just saying. But when you think about, like someone brought up Google Glass earlier. So Google Glass, their first prototype, which we'll talk about a little later, but their first prototype took them 45 minutes to build. I know you're like, what? Because they used straw and string and tape and pins, because they understood that it was important to see how people would use something than how it actually looks at the first glance. And the way they went about the process is, so they brought people in, they built up a projector and everything, and they brought people in, and then they said, okay, pretend you're using it. Everyone, they see Minority Report, the movie, and it's like, you swipe here, you swipe. You're like, yeah, this is awesome. I'm loving it. Now, this is where your observation skills come into play. So this is an example observation. So you have people critiquing in this moment. They're like, oh, I like this. This is great. But then after they continue to watch people and they notice that people's arm started to fall a little bit and that it was hurting them, to do this activity. And so they realized that while it looks nice and fancy in the movies, real world people wouldn't do that. And so they had to go back to the drawing board, build another prototype, and see how people engage with it then. So they used an example of critiquing and observation to glean results out of that. So it's okay to build in a combination to try to find good research methodology. One of the most frequently mentioned types are interviewing and discussions. End of the day, we hear about focus groups, we hear about one-on-one interviewing. ePharmax is in this building. I know they do a lot of research within this building with people around health and around their product essentially. But when we talk about interviewing discussion, you have to avoid yes or no types of questions. You want to inspire storytelling. You want people to want to open up to you. And that requires building trust. Now, usually I have people go through this very awkward exercise in which I make you stand up and look into each other's eyes for a minute with no words. It's always fun. But Christy, I was like, I don't know about this group if they want to do that. So I didn't do that today. But you have to learn how to build trust with people. And sometimes the facilitator you may think is best is not the best person to actually do this. Because when you're asking people to give their all or to converse with you, one, people like to share their stories. We actually don't use that enough. But then we also have to think about what's the connectedness between the person that's interviewing them and the interviewee. But I also would argue to push beyond just the interview and the typical, okay, here's my 10-point question, I'm going to ask you these questions, because you may find that this person is taking you on another path you wouldn't have thought of otherwise prior to this research that you then need to explore. So be nimble, be agile, and use that to your advantage. Also recognize that silence is okay. As human beings, we like to fill in silence. It's awkward. But silence can tell you something, because you may have found that there might be a nugget there that I can pull out. But this is where that trust and that respect comes in hand, because you have some that in that moment may be okay to explore deeper into that silence if you ask them, and you may have some that say, I'd rather not, and you have to be respectful of what people want. So nudge a little, but not too much. But know that silence is telling in itself. Even just observing, okay, there was silence in this moment will help you in really assessing what we're doing. So today, I don't know how long you've been together. I'm gonna be honest, I came in, I have no idea. You might be best friends by now. But I want you to find someone you do not know or you haven't had much engagement with within this room. And I want you to interview each other for 5 minutes each using open-ended questions. You can ask them about their company. You can ask them about themselves. But I would push you to actually move beyond what's your position, what's your company, what does it do? Because even when we network, that's what we normally do, right? Hey, who do you work for? And then sometimes we'll hear, oh, you work for a company I don't really know, so I'm moving on. Okay? We want you to move beyond that. I've even had people do in interviews ask them, do you like chocolate, strawberry, or Neapolitan ice cream? And I know that seems weird, but then it makes them laugh, and we can then have a deeper conversation. And so find your pairs. We're gonna do this quickly, because I know Christy's like gunning on the time. But let's find your...
12 minutes.
Crystal just stole all my time.
I'm just saying.
Okay, so what we're gonna do is 2.5 minutes each.
Maybe just turn to your neighbor.
Yeah, turn to your neighbor and interview each other, 2.5 minutes. I'm not gonna give you a prompt, go ahead and go. All right, I always hate shutting down conversation, and I know some teams did not hear me say switch because the dialogue was so good. But one, continue practicing with each other beyond this. But when you usually are interviewing someone, interviews can take as long as, honestly, 30 minutes to hours, depending on how good the conversation is going. But you want to be respectful of other people's time. Obviously, I very much made you go like this, but obviously preparation is key. Allow for organic dialogue, and just know that set aside the time, be respectful of that person's time, but they may actually say, hey, the conversation is going so well, let's keep going. You never know. Quickly, we're going to go through this. So if you do have questions, please wait until the end because I don't want Christy to pull me off the stage with a candy cane or something. So the next thing is defining your users or needs. And you're asking the question of what need do we intend to address? So what do we want to learn is different from what need do we intend to address. So you want to really understand your users or the people that you're serving because you want to come up with the best solution for them, and you need to be able to analyze and synthesize what you've learned. And then you also need to reframe the problem based on their needs. So when this gentleman brought up how they use different language, it even can go beyond that where you may think you're solving this solution, but even when you were talking, Crystal, as a marketer, was like, I like the weather idea. And when I recently met someone in San Francisco, and they do a lot of work around disabilities, and they were pitching their product as the Netflix for people with disabilities. And you might have some people that say, Airbnb, we are the Airbnb of this industry. Sometimes you can do that, sometimes it will not fit the mold. But you need to understand what their needs are and fit it into that space. Common tools to kind of analyze needs. You see a lot of people use user personas, essentially, where you kind of put this fake name, a range of an age, what their occupation may be, what their barriers are to help guide your process. While yes, earlier I mentioned avoid stereotypes and assumptions, that doesn't mean that these tools are not helpful. Just be mindful and conscious that these are literally just tools. That's all that they are. That doesn't mean that the be all, go all, just know that these are just to help you guide you through the process. But then there's also problem statements, which I'll give you an example of, experience diagramming, concept mapping, things of that nature. So this is an example of a user persona. I'm not going to go into it because you have a copy of this presentation, but look deeper into what some of these categories are and recognize that this is just an example. You may find that there's a different category that you want to assess and research for your company. When focusing, and I call everything a design problem because I see every solution as a design. That's just how I look at it. And so when understanding the design problem, you have to analyze the patterns, but like I said, also pay attention to those outliers because most of the times those are the innovative or sometimes the most effective solutions to or the most effective insight to what you're trying to solve. So when defining a user need, you have an example of this that doesn't look like this, where it has the circle in the middle, and you have things, actions, feelings, heard. This is what we call the empathy map, where you usually draw the person or the user, or sometimes I put the topic in the middle, and then try to respond to the prompt. So what are the actions of these individuals? What are the things that you hear from these individuals? What are some of the feelings that they have and that they invoke? And so you want to, I recommend using this worksheet. Feel free to make copies to help you along your process. I love these. I feel like if you don't have a problem need statement, then you're just all over the place. But a problem need statement is literally defining that person, saying what they need, and then taking an insight from the empathy stage and making it action-oriented. So this is an example. A teenage girl with a bleak outlook needs to feel more socially acceptable when eating healthy food because in her world, a social risk is more dangerous than a health risk. So in this situation, many times the youth need to eat healthier. They need nutritious food. And the way that we go about it, majority of the time when they don't do market research, is that we just need to tell them that it's healthy. And this is the way to live. And you have a longer life. But as a teenager, they don't care. At least this one doesn't. They want to actually see how this is engaging with their social life. Are their friends eating healthy? So this is where influencers play a role. How can this actually impact my social standing within my school? It's my school all around community gardening, and that's a form of popularity, and I'm throwing it out there here. Okay. But that's something they will have to look into when having this problem statement. Also, ask how might we questions. because they are open-ended. And what the activity we like to do is we say, how might we put a prompt at the end, and then we take Post-it notes and we just throw them out there in response to this question. And then we usually ask around 3 to 5 different how might we prompts, and we intermix those responses together. So some people like to categorize them, like this was the response to these questions. No, you want to put them all together, make it messy, and then you start to look at those patterns and what comes out of them. Because you may find that even though you are asking 5 different questions, there seems to be a lot of discussion in this one cluster. So I recommend doing that as well. An entrepreneurial problem is action-oriented, is people or human-centered. But the last thing I'm gonna say, because I know how much time do I have?
3 minutes?
You're so nice, you just added a minute. Okay. One of the last things I will say is that many times as individuals, we put constraints on ourselves. We are our worst enemies. And sometimes our company, we are our worst enemies. You know, we don't have the money to do this. But yet, and I just recently met the CEO of the Highline Park in New York. And he started as a journalist, and he didn't agree with the route they were trying to take to pull down this track. And so they decided they wanted to do a park. And they found that they had to do market research. And they found out that market research in their case was $150,000. And they only had $3,000 in the bank. Now, they could have said, well, we can't, actually I think they did at one point, we don't have the money for that. We can't do it, you know, dreams shattered. But one of their board members, this is why you need people that are dissenters around you, said that if you can't raise $150,000 to get a market researcher, how are you going to raise $100 million for the park? So put it in that perspective. You are raising a business, a company. This is a child. You're hoping this child gets to 90, 100 years old, and let's be ambitious, 200, because apparently 200-year-old people are out there. I'm just saying that they're somewhere in the cut. But that's what you're striving towards. This is year 1, year 2. If you can't find that investment, whether it's humans, whether it's money, whether it's time, then how are you going to be able to do that down the road? So challenge yourself, move beyond that perspective and those constraints we give ourselves, and make sure that research is part of that process. And I'm gonna end on that. Okay.